The glass atrium of Cade BioVentures headquarters on Michigan Avenue was bathed in the cold blue light of a Tuesday morning when Bridget Langston felt the first wave of dread crawl up her spine. She hadn't planned to be here. At 8 months pregnant, her feet ached by noon, and her back had been a slow, steady fire since week 30. But the lab results had come back wrong. Marshall's name on a contract she wasn't supposed to see, forwarded accidentally to her work iPad when the wireless sync glitched overnight. 3 lines of text that turned her world on its axis. She needed to look him in the eye. The elevator was too slow. She took the stairs. On the 4th floor landing, the door swung open before she could push it, and Dinah Cross stepped out. Bridget had seen her once, at the company's holiday party 18 months ago, blonde, precise, carrying a glass of Chablis like a weapon. Marshall had called her the firm's best outside counsel, a professional necessity. Now Dinah's eyes swept over Bridget's belly with something close to contempt. "You shouldn't be here," Dinah said, voice flat as marble. "I need to find my husband." Bridget kept her voice even. Dinah stepped closer, close enough that Bridget could smell her perfume. Sharp, expensive, wrong for a Tuesday morning. "He's in a board session. He can't be disturbed." "Then I'll wait." Something shifted in Dinah's expression. Her jaw tightened. "You don't understand how any of this works, do you?" she said quietly. "He's moving on. The company, his life, you're not part of either anymore." Bridget's heart cracked down the center, but she didn't move. That was when Dinah's hand shot forward. It wasn't a shove exactly. It was the kind of thing that could be called an accident in a different light, a firm push at Bridget's shoulder that sent her staggering back against the metal railing of the landing. Her hip struck first, then her palm slapped the handrail. She grabbed it, gasping, one foot sliding off the edge of the top stair. A woman's scream came from somewhere below. Bridget clutched the railing with everything she had, the world tilting, her free hand pressed hard against her stomach. The baby moved. One sharp, frantic kick, and for 3 seconds all she could do was breathe. Oh my God. Someone was running up the stairs, a receptionist in a gray blazer, hands already reaching. "Mrs. Cade, are you?" Bridget looked up. Dinah was already gone. The door to the 4th floor swung shut behind the click of her heels. 2 floors below, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline, Marshall Cade's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at the screen, Bridget calling, and turned it face down. 3 years earlier, Bridget Langston had been on call in the neonatal ICU at Northwestern Memorial Hospital when Marshall walked into the hospital cafeteria at 2 in the morning with a dead phone and a lost expression. He was visiting a colleague's newborn, he said. He'd taken the wrong elevator. He had an easy smile and a way of asking questions that made her feel like the most interesting person in any room. They married 14 months later. It was small. Her father, Senator Wendell Langston, insisted on the private gallery at the Art Institute for the reception, but the ceremony itself was just family. Wendell stood at the back of the room in his best suit, the same man who had spent 30 years in the United States Senate without ever learning to cry in public, and cried anyway. She had believed in Marshall's ambition. He'd built Cade BioVentures from a 2-person operation in a Wicker Park loft into a company valued at nearly $400 million. She'd believed it was their life together, even when the nights got shorter, when the dinner reservations went unkept, when he started mentioning Dinah Cross the way men mention someone they're already thinking about. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself that until the night, her iPad synced the wrong account. Marshall's work email had been linked to her device by mistake, a shared Apple ID from when they first moved in together, never properly separated. She'd woken at 3 in the morning to a notification, a thread she was never meant to see. Subject line, "Handle the situation before the filing." The email below it was from Marshall to Dinah, dated 5 weeks earlier. "She's suspicious. If she starts talking to anyone at the firm before the IPO closes, everything falls apart. Keep her distracted however you need to." Bridget read it 4 times. Then she got dressed, called a car, and drove to Michigan Avenue in the gray cold of a Chicago morning. Senator Wendell Langston received the call at 7:42 a.m. He was in his Chicago field office, reviewing infrastructure amendments with his chief of staff, a man named Quentin Foley, who had worked for him for 11 years, and could read his moods better than most members of his own family. When Wendell picked up the phone and heard the words, "Your daughter fell on a staircase," he was already standing. By the time they told him she was conscious, he was already walking out the door. In the car, he said nothing. Quentin didn't try to fill the silence. At Northwestern Memorial's emergency wing, Wendell found Bridget in a monitoring bay, both hands pressed over her belly, watching the fetal heart rate graph on the screen beside her. She was pale but composed in the way people get when they're running on adrenaline and sheer will. He took her hand. "The baby," he said. "Fine." Her voice was thin, heart rate steady. "They want to keep me for observation." He looked at the bruise forming along her forearm where she'd grabbed the railing. His jaw went tight in the way it did before a Senate floor vote. The expression that journalists had learned, over 3 decades, meant he had already decided what came next. "Tell me everything," he said. She did. She told him about the email, about Dinah, about the staircase. When she finished, she showed him the thread still open on her work iPad. Wendell read it without expression. Then he handed the device to Quentin without a word. Quentin read it, looked up. "That's enough to open a civil case, possibly more." Wendell was already staring at the hallway. "Get the building's security footage. Michigan Avenue, 4th floor stairwell between 7:15 and 7:50 this morning, and find out everything there is to know about Dinah Cross." "She's the firm's outside counsel," Bridget said quietly. "She's been working with Marshall for 2 years. Wendell nodded once. "How long has she been more than that?" Bridget looked down at her hands. "Longer than I want to know." He sat beside her. For a moment he was not a senator, not a man who had spent his career calibrating power in rooms full of people who confused volume for strength. He was just a father looking at his daughter in a hospital bed. And the weight of that, the specific weight, of having let professional distance substitute for presence over the past 3 years, pressed down on him in a way no vote ever had. "I should have been paying closer attention," he said. "Dad." "No. I knew Marshall was cutting you out of his decisions. I saw it and I told myself it was his business and your marriage, and neither was mine to manage." He exhaled slowly. "That ends today." Marshall Cade surfaced from his board meeting at 9:15 to find 12 missed calls and a voicemail from the hospital that turned his face the color of chalk. By the time he arrived at Northwestern Memorial, Wendell was already in the corridor outside Bridget's room, standing with his hands in his coat pockets, watching Marshall walk toward him with the stillness of someone who has spent decades waiting for opponents to make the first mistake. "She's resting," Wendell said. Marshall exhaled. "Thank God. I came as soon as How is she? Is the baby?" "They're both alive." The word alive landed without any surrounding warmth. "No thanks to your calendar." Marshall's expression tightened. "I didn't know she was coming to the office. If I had—" "If you had," Wendell said carefully, "you might have stopped your attorney from shoving my pregnant daughter down a staircase." That's a generous reading of the situation. Marshall's eyes flickered. "I don't know what Dinah did. I wasn't there." That's been your answer to most things lately, hasn't it? It was not a question. You weren't at the 20-week ultrasound. You weren't there when she moved half her clothes back to her father's apartment. And you weren't there this morning, so the woman you've been seeing for 2 years handled things for you. Dinah is not. Wendell pulled out his phone and held it up. On the screen was the email thread, sent from Marshall's own account. "Keep her distracted however you need to." Marshall went very still. "I sent that to manage a—" "Stop." Wendell's voice dropped to something quieter and more final than anything he said from a podium. "Every word out of your mouth right now will be used in a courtroom. I would think carefully." Marshall's mouth closed. Quentin appeared at Wendell's shoulder, holding a printed still from the building's security footage. It showed the stairwell landing, Dinah's posture, Bridget staggering back, the railing catch, frame by frame, inescapable. "Security footage is already with Chicago PD," Quentin said, addressing Marshall directly. "The hospital has documented the bruising as consistent with a fall caused by external force. Mrs. Cade gave a formal statement an hour ago." Marshall looked between them. Something cracked open behind his eyes. I never wanted it to go this far. Wendell picked up his coat. You wanted the IPO. You wanted $400 million and Dinah Cross, and a clean exit from a marriage that had become inconvenient. You just didn't want to account for the cost. He walked past him toward Bridget's room. The bill comes due regardless. Dinah Cross spent the morning in her River North apartment cycling through what she believed were her strongest arguments. She had been provoked. Bridget had arrived without warning. The contact on the stairs was incidental, reflexive, not premeditated. By noon, her phone was full of messages from Marshall, telling her to stay offline and say nothing. She ignored them. Instead, she opened her laptop. By 2 o'clock, a cluster of anonymous social media accounts had begun circulating a story. Unstable wife of biotech founder harasses company attorney, refuses to accept that marriage is over. 2 Instagram posts appeared with out-of-context photos of Bridget outside Northwestern Memorial from months before. A Chicago gossip newsletter picked it up within the hour. Quentin's team flagged it before 5. She's running a narrative, Quentin told Wendell. They were in the downtown field office, 2 members of the legal team sitting across the table with laptops open. The accounts are new, the IP trails are offshore, but the coordination pattern matches a paid PR operation. Wendell looked at the flagged content without touching it. Trace the money. It took until midnight. The accounts were funded through a digital marketing firm registered in Delaware 3 months prior. The firm's incorporation documents listed a registered agent tied to Cade BioVentures' general legal retainer, Dinah's firm. The legal team stacked the documentation in a folder. She's been preparing this for a while, one of the attorneys said. Wendell closed the folder. So have we. In her hospital room that night, Bridget saw the fake stories on her phone just after dinner. Her night nurse found her staring at the screen with the kind of expression that comes just before tears, or just after deciding not to cry anymore. They're calling me unstable, Bridget said. They're saying I harassed her, that I showed up unhinged and started the whole thing. What do the people who were actually there say? Bridget was quiet for a moment, then she almost smiled. The receptionist who caught me on the stairs. She already gave a statement to the police. Then that's the story that matters. Quentin called at 10 that night. We have everything we need, he said. Footage, medical records, the email chain, the funding trail for the smear accounts, and 3 witnesses who were on lower floors of that stairwell. Your father wants to know if you're ready. Bridget looked out at the Chicago skyline, the lake invisible in the dark, but present the way it always was. Something vast and patient just beyond the light. Tell him yes, she said. But I want Dinah to answer for what she did as her own case, not as a footnote to Marshall's financial scandal. What she did to me and to the baby, that stands on its own. That's already in the filing, Quentin said. Marshall Cade's IPO roadshow was scheduled for the Thursday of the following week. A press event at the Blackstone Hotel's Grand Ballroom, with investors and journalists invited to watch Cade BioVentures step into its next chapter. He had spent 6 months preparing for it. Every slide, every projection, every word of his opening statement. Senator Wendell Langston RSVP'd as a guest 2 days before the event. Marshall's team debated whether to uninvite him. In the end, they decided the optics of turning away a sitting U.S. senator were worse than whatever the senator might do from an audience seat. They underestimated what Wendell would do before the opening remarks. The ballroom was full. 67 investors, 24 journalists, cameras from 3 local stations. Marshall took the stage at 9 in the morning in a new suit, his opening slide glowing behind him on a screen that stretched 12 feet wide. He thanked everyone for coming. He said this was a milestone. He said the future of biotech in the Midwest was standing in this room. He was 4 sentences in when every screen in the ballroom changed. The security footage from the Michigan Avenue stairwell replaced his presentation slide. 42 seconds of footage, time-stamped, independently authenticated by 2 forensic analysts. Dinah's hand at Bridget's shoulder. The stumble. The desperate grab at the railing. Bridget's palm pressed against her belly as she held on. The room went absolutely silent. A journalist near the front raised her camera. Wendell Langston stood from his seat in the 3rd row. He didn't reach for a microphone. He didn't need one. He had spent 30 years making himself heard in rooms that didn't want to listen. "My daughter is a physician," he said, addressing the room without looking at the stage. "She has spent her career delivering other people's children safely into the world. 8 months into her own pregnancy, she was shoved down a staircase by an attorney employed by this company on the instruction of its founder." He let the footage run to its end. The documentation supporting that statement, emails, financial records, police filings, has been distributed to every journalist in this room as of this morning. He sat back down. The ballroom erupted. Marshall stood at the podium with his mouth open, the way a man looks when he has run out of words in the only language he thought he was fluent in. His lead investor was already on his phone in the aisle. 3 journalists were moving toward the exit. One of board members turned her chair slightly away from the stage, the smallest possible gesture that meant everything. Dinah Cross was not in the building. She had been picked up by Chicago Police Department investigators at her apartment 40 minutes earlier, pursuant to a warrant for felony battery of a pregnant person. The arraignment was held on a Wednesday morning in Cook County. Bridget sat in the gallery in a gray maternity coat and sensible flats. Her bruising had faded from purple to yellow-green. The baby's vitals had been normal for 2 straight weeks. Dinah pleaded not guilty. Her attorney argued emotional provocation. The judge read through the authentication records, the written statements, the medical report, and denied bail reduction without elaborating further. Bridget's divorce petition had been filed the Monday before the arraignment through her own attorney, a woman she had chosen herself with no involvement from her father's office. Marshall did not contest it. At the criminal trial 6 weeks later, the prosecution played the footage, read the email chain, and called the stairwell receptionist as its first witness. Dinah's attorney presented a character profile and argued that the physical contact had been reflexive, unintentional, a momentary loss of control rather than a planned act. Then the prosecutor played the voice memo. It had been recorded by a junior paralegal at Dinah's firm, a 24-year-old woman who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with what she was being asked to facilitate. In it, Dinah's voice was unhurried and businesslike. "If Bridget Cage shows up at that building before the IPO closes, it needs to be handled. She cannot be allowed to blow this up, whatever it takes." The jury took 4 hours. Guilty on felony battery of a pregnant person. Guilty on conspiracy to intimidate a witness. 3 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, plus mandatory restitution. Her law license was referred to the state bar for disciplinary review the same afternoon. Marshall was not charged criminally. The prosecution determined the email did not meet the threshold for direct incitement. But the civil suit Bridget filed resulted in a settlement negotiated without her having to sit in the same room as him. The terms were sealed. The IPO was formally withdrawn the day of the verdict. 4 of Cade BioVentures' 7 board members resigned within a week. When the judge dismissed the court, Bridget stood, gathered her coat, and walked out of the courtroom beside her father. Outside, November air off Lake Michigan cut through the afternoon. You could see your breath. Wendell started to say something. She shook her head. "Give me a minute." She stood on the courthouse steps and breathed. The city moved around her. Cabs, pedestrians, the distant sound of a commuter train pulling away. She pressed her hand to her stomach and felt the familiar reply. A slow roll. Something small and warm pressing back. "Okay," she said. Wendell put his arm around her shoulders, carefully, the way he used to when she was small and the world had briefly become too large. "Okay," he agreed. 6 weeks later, Bridget's daughter was born at 6:47 in the morning, in the same hospital where she had spent nearly a decade learning to bring other people's children safely into the world. The labor was 11 hours. Wendell was in the waiting room for all of it. She named the baby Nell Langston. She used her maiden name on the birth certificate. 3 weeks after that, Bridget sat in the living room of her father's Lincoln Park house, with Nell asleep on her chest, the sound of the city muffled by old brick walls and good windows. Wendell was in his chair across the room reading a bill, the same way he had always spent Sunday evenings for as long as she could remember. "I've been thinking about going back to teaching," she said, "part-time." The residency program at Northwestern asked me last year. I said I was too busy. He looked up. Are you still too busy? She considered Nell's small fist, curled against her collarbone. No. I think I just told myself it wasn't the right time. I've been waiting for a right time for a lot of things. Wendell set his reading down. Your mother used to say that women in our family had a habit of making themselves smaller to fit into spaces other people carved out for them. She said it like it was a warning. Bridget looked at her daughter. She thought about the stairwell. She thought about the moment her palm hit the railing, and the world stopped tilting, and she understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with thought, that she was going to hold on. She was right, Bridget said. But I'm done fitting. Outside, the first snow of December was beginning. Slow and unhurried, settling over Lincoln Park like something that had always been on its way. Nell shifted against her chest. Bridget held her closer, and for the first time in longer than she could measure. The quiet felt like something she had chosen, rather than something left over after everything else was taken.